Hi everyone, welcome to Lotus Chat Worldwide episode 4. This week we have a special request and we're going to dedicate this week's topic to our dear friend Vanessa. One day I'll see you, okay girl? And today, this week, we will talk about dealing with negativity, building connection through critical communication. So just a quick recap to everyone who's watching this for the first time. Lotus Chat Worldwide, the reason why we're here is because we discuss topics every week and our goal and purpose is to empower women collectively. So let's dive in straight away. The first prompt that we have this week for our discussion is when and why do you think criticism hurts? What do you think, Laura?
Well, ever since I was a little girl, I worked really hard to avoid criticism. It just cut me like a knife in my heart anytime someone said anything bad. And I really haven't figured out why that was, but it stayed with me as an adult to the point I couldn't have those hard conversations with people because if I heard criticism of myself, what I would do is I'd go inside and stay there. I ran away because the pain of the criticism was greater than speaking my truth or finding my voice. And that's not very helpful when you are trying to be in a relationship or when you're trying to be in a friendship or anything like that. It's also hard when you're raising kids because even kids can be hurtful. It was hard for me in the workplace because I wanted to do such a great job that everyone would only say wonderful things. Well, that's not realistic in this world. So what I found was I spent more time trying to protect myself from being hurt by criticism, and I would avoid it at all costs. Until about 6-7 years ago, and I started working on myself, and I started asking myself questions about where I was going and what was working for me and what wasn't. And I found that I was missing out on a lot of things because I was working so hard to avoid criticism. So what I learned in myself is that I was seeking external factors to validate myself. The problem is, unless you've got a script you hand to everybody telling you what you need to hear, they really don't know. And so I learned the importance of validating myself. And I grew up thinking that if I validated myself, I was somehow bragging. But I think it's really important that we acknowledge who we are and our greatness, the strengths that we have, and honoring ourselves. And so when I started doing that and I started validating myself, and I started working with people that were acknowledgers, not negative people, I started feeling like I can relax now. And if now when I hear criticism, I can't say I love it, but I take it as feedback. I say, if it works, I'll use it. And if it doesn't work, I just put it to the side. So I think criticism hurts when we're seeking validation from someone outside of ourselves instead of looking at it neutrally. And that's what I've learned. Jen, how about you?
Those are all wonderful points, Laura. I definitely can relate to a lot of what you just said. Yes, I mean, criticism can hurt. And especially, when you're growing up, going through, grammar school, middle school, even high school, I mean, the amount of pressure that is put on you to be and do things a certain way. And then if you go against the mold, then of course, you start hearing your peers start saying things, and it can make you feel a little bit, I'm going to say different, but not in a good way. And the key to this is as you realize as you get older, and that these type of people are going to be around you no matter where you go, whether it's in school or work or even on the street. I mean, you start realizing it's not you, it's them. It's either maybe they're having a bad day and they're taking it out on you. Maybe they weren't given the attention and the love that maybe you yourself got, and that's why they take it out on other people. there are a lot of instances where you kind of have to take a step back and look at it from an outside perspective. Where is that person coming from in that moment when they are giving you that criticism? And then once you kind of think about that, you're like, okay, all right, I hear you, but it does not mean that I have to let what you're telling me bring me down. And I know one instance growing up in high school, I did feel really different. I felt like I wasn't like everybody in my class because there were certain things that I loved to do that other girls would just not like, or I would get picked on. And it definitely made me feel like I wasn't smart or I wasn't like a part of the group. And I know that we all want to be a part of a group. So when we're singled out because of that criticism, it hurts. So just always remember, take yourself out of that situation. Do not let it get to you. Do not let it sit in your, because it does, it sits in your heart, it sits in your brain. Just remember, it's not you, it's them. So always remember that. What about you, Jazzy?
I'm glad we're touching on this. This was a hard one for me to digest growing up, because I was bullied, and my cousins and just kids in school, they weren't always the nicest. And I was the only girl in my family. So I often was the butt of all the jokes and a lot of the things about what I looked like, my appearance, and how I did things. So one thing that I've learned, and it wasn't until most recent years, is that perception is projection. So what this means to me is what someone may say, whether it's a negative judgment or criticism, that is something either within them that they wish they had, or something that they don't like about themselves.
Right.
So knowing this, and I love the 4 laws of agreement for this law of not taking it personally and always doing my best, regardless of any criticism. So one of the programmings that I picked up growing up was, if I was criticized, and since I wanted to be accepted and liked, I would just tuck it in and just hold on to it and still try to forge forward anyways, until the bullying got too much, and then I would retreat. So of course, then just wanting to be accepted and still putting myself in positions to be liked. And essentially, as I grew older, this grew into like people pleasing,
Right.
which is a totally toxic trait that I've learned for myself to carry on in my life. And now knowing like different tools and different ways to give myself love and respect is why I choose to no longer let that affect me.
I agree on that as well. And I also like what you say about not taking it personally from the laws of agreement. And I think why criticism hurts is because we actually care about the person who told us that criticism. We care enough to listen. They care enough to give us that criticism. But if only that we could process that criticism. So first, like what Laura said, it's a feedback. It's neutral. If it lands, it lands. And if it doesn't, then we'll move on. That's what Coach Jess really told me so many times, And I think when we finally decide that we're going to land that criticism and process it, maybe we can process it in 2 ways, It's an intellectual criticism and not emotional. So we process it with our mind and hear the intention and hear what we can improve from it, but not make it an emotional criticism. So maybe that might work.
Deanne, I love what you said there about the processing part. As you grow older and you, as I mentioned before, you start kind of realizing where people are coming from in a situation or an experience. I mean, I love to improve. I mean, if somebody is telling me, okay, like, especially when it comes to relationships, I have, as much as one can say that a breakup can hurt and it could really like make you feel not so good about yourself. Looking back, I've realized that I've learned so much from those experiences and from what I was told in those relationships, things that, okay, maybe at the time I wasn't really necessarily listening to, because again, I was stuck in that emotional part of the relationship. But now that I look back, I'm like, okay, maybe I was a little this, or maybe I was a tiny bit too much in this area. Like I'm willing to admit it. And it's always great when I can meet somebody who's also willing to say, yes, like I completely recognize where I've been, what I've been doing, but I am open to improving. And you can get to that point when you allow constructive criticism and not bullying, because there are two different things. The bullying is something that should not be done in any way, shape, or form. You know, if you're being singled out for something that makes you unique and beautiful and just wonderful, no, absolutely not. But if it isn't a constructive criticism, or somebody is saying, let's say in my case, early on, you know, I had a significant other tell me, look, you know, you don't need to check up and ask me, you know, for validation all the time about whether or not we're okay. You know, if we're not okay, I will tell you, but when you keep asking me, are we okay? Is this relationship okay? Then it shows that you are unsure. And they're like, I love you, Jen. I love you. You don't need to keep asking me if we're okay. So that is a lesson I learned, and that a man will tell you and be honest with you if things are not working out, you know. But anyways, that's my experience.
And the communication is congruent.
Yes.
I love that.
Yes.
And so how did you learn that was your, like, that you could be secure in that and no longer seeking that validation?
That's a great question, Jazzy. I think how I came to that realization, it comes when you develop self-love. That is the key. Once you develop self-love, whether you're in a relationship with a significant other, whether you are managing a program at work, you know, whatever it is that you're doing in a position where it's an important one, once you have self-love, if the other things around you, you know, are doing their own thing and everything's just flowing, you just flow with it. And, you know, if things start going in a different way than expected, then you're like, okay, well, it's good. It was nice knowing you. Thank you for the experience.
Right.
I'm going to go find a new job, or I'm going to go out there and start dating again.
It kind of like ties back into like self-acknowledgement. Yeah. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
And I know someone brought up the emotional quotient. And so when that comes up in the emotional arena of when we intake criticism, I find that it's important to be able to realize that like we are in charge of those emotions and we get to choose. We can feel it, sure, it might be unconscious, but as soon as we do, like that's when we get to shift and take what we've learned, acknowledge it, and either we validate whether or not it's true or not, and can choose how we feel from that.
So, interesting question. So in terms of where we're at in discussing criticism, negativity, and self-acknowledgement, if somebody were to come across somebody who is, you know, giving them either a negative feedback, for example, that they feel is negative, and it's an important person, how does one deal with that situation? And what is the boundary to where that situation becomes toxic, if it is a toxic situation they're in, for example?
That's a great question. I think for me, I value feedback if it's done in the right way. And what I mean by that is there's a way to provide someone feedback without pointing the finger at them and saying, you make me feel like this. There's numerous ways to do it, but this is how I feel when this happens, where you take ownership of your feelings, but you do it in a way that you're not putting the other person on the spot. So for me, the boundary is if it's done in the right way where I'm not feeling defensive, I'm like, okay, I'm going to listen to this. Can I accept it? Is it something that I can do? Is it something that rings true? Does it resonate with me? But I've also been a part where it becomes personal, especially at work. Work should never be personal, but some people have to be personal before it's back to them. I've also had that in personal relationships too, where it's very personal and it's just, I'm hurting inside, so I'm going to make you hurt just as bad as I hurt. But it doesn't feel that way to the person standing there. So for me, the boundary is when it starts hurting personally and I don't feel that I can argue that point, or sometimes I just decide to remove myself because it's just not worth the fight when someone's in that mode. So for me, the boundary is if they are in a place where it's coming out that they're angry and there's more going on than just me. The boundary for me is, I think we should talk about this at another time when you feel calmer and we can have a fair conversation. But until then, I think we should table this and talk at another time. The other way to diffuse that when it's personal is just to start talking in a very calm tone and not raise it, not get into a heated conversation, but say, I think we should talk about this at another time. And just, that's when I go into the calm mode. But I think it's important for us, especially those of us that have worked on self-love. And I love that, Jen, like you were talking about. I think it's important to have boundaries. It's not okay to be the whipping post and become a puddle of emotion. It's important to say, I value you. You have a right to speak your truth, but I also have a right to not listen to it if it's personal or hurtful.
I like that, Laura. Sorry, Jessie, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was just gonna say, like, I was told one time to acknowledge when someone's furnace is kicked on. So that's, you can readjust the boundary.
Yeah. And I also like what Laura said about, knowing your boundaries and setting them, because I agree when oh, by the way, this unexpected mail, I have to share this. And it says there, set boundaries and respect them. So I think that really resonates with me, and I hope that resonates with you for those who are watching too. Setting boundaries is not, for me, it's not avoidance, because sometimes we are really not in that mood to listen to it, but set our own boundaries and respect them. So for me, it would be when I hear criticism, I like to ask for clarification on the criticism, because what I hear or interpret may be emotional because I'm hearing the emotions, but I'm not really hearing what's the main point. And sometimes maybe they really don't have a main point. They just, it's not, it's an emotional, like what Laura said, it's a personal judgment. So, and it's maybe it gets more emotional. So sometimes we need to know to differentiate between criticism and judgments. Or maybe it's just a moment that they need to let out their feelings or their emotions. So when I attempt to clarify, and then I can hear the real emotions versus a real feedback or criticism, that's when it helps me to process that. And I think for me also, like what Laura says, setting boundaries also mean that, hey, okay, this is what I'm hearing. I'll come back to you on this and I'll process it a little bit more before we talk more about this, because it's not going to help the situation. It's going to turn into an unnecessary argument. Yeah,
absolutely. It's always good to get that clarification so that way you guys can stay congruent on the same page. And as far as for me and boundaries, I feel like boundaries are to be implemented no matter whether it's a negative or a positive, or it's always good to know where I am internally and to be able to protect my energy. Especially as an empath, I can be listening to someone and they may be having a really bad day and I might like take that on. And I don't, like in the past, I used to just take it on and not know why I was so drained later on. So setting healthy, energetic boundaries are important for me.
I got you, Jen. I got you, Jessie. Yeah. What do you think, Jen?
No, I think everything that we've touched on is very important to recognize. I love that we're touching on the whole thing about negative self-talk as well as external negative stuff that can come at you, and how and this really comes down to the power of the mind and the power of the words. There is a lot of power in what we say, and a lot of power with our thoughts. I mean, if it's funny, this topic that we're discussing today for my friend Vanessa is very relevant to a discussion I had with a friend just yesterday about the fact that I was self-sabotaging every time I put myself into a negative mindset that something wasn't going to work out, or that I had like a worry, like, what if this happens? And what if, this doesn't work out? Like, and she told me, Jen, you need to calm down. What if it works out? What if the situation does end up in your favor? She's telling me, she told me, like, she read the book The Secret, and she's like, I absolutely love that book, and I want you to read it, Jen, because it's exactly what I'm trying to tell you to do right now, which is turn that thought that you're having about something that you are really passionate about, and think about how passionate you are about it, and not about how it's not going to work out for you. Because the more you think about it in that negative way, the more you're going to call in what you're thinking. So in the case of this instance, this experience, I was like, wow, I really, really need to switch in my brain. And I know we talked about it, and to everybody, if you haven't seen Lotus, one of the previous Lotus chat episodes, we do talk a little about them shifting the mind in those negative situations. And I'm only human, and I was about to do it again, but it took that conversation with my friend to remind me how powerful I am, and how much how much of my life I can change, especially in this instance, if I just stay positive about it and go in with an open heart and an open mind. Yeah. So.
The other thing about boundary is also, I feel that sometimes as women, our curiosity takes over the situation. Like when somebody gives us a one-liner feedback and you're not prepared to hear for it, instead, our curiosity overtakes, and then we start asking for more, or we start asking for more clarification. But actually at that point, we're not ready. And probably the right thing to say is, knowing that it's going to be coming, knowing that the feedback's coming, we can say, like, let's do this discussion another time, rather than keep poking at it,
You brought up such a great point that I want to kind of highlight on, Zian, and that's when we start reacting. And that is our next point, is unpacking which critic we're talking about. Is it the critic that we're looking at and who is maybe not criticizing in a way that is palatable? Or is it our inner critic? Is it that voice in our head that is telling us a story that's not reality, but it's what we keep hearing? And I think that's really important. So for me, it took me a long time to practice the art of quieting that inner voice. That inner voice can cause you to lead a life that really isn't a life, because you're living this internal life. And I had someone explain to me what that inner voice is. When we grow up and we live life, there are some things that we learn that we react to. We react to strong voices. We react to negative feedback. We react to all kinds of things. And so our mind tells us this is bad, this is good, you need to react, you need to move away. And it's kind of like when you teach your children not to touch the stove when it's hot because you'll get burned. Our mind does the same thing to protect us. So that inner voice is your mind trying to fill in the gap to say, don't get hurt. Don't let yourself experience this. This is what will happen. The problem is the mind can't differentiate between surviving physically and what hurt us emotionally. And that's up to us. So there are things that we can practice to do that. But I had to learn to unpack the inner critic so that I could say, this isn't accurate. This isn't what really is happening. And to be able to relax and move forward in life. And I think a lot of us have to battle that inner critic and learn how to do that ourselves. How about you, Zian? How have you learned to battle that inner critic?
That's a tough one. I think every time when I hear criticism, I am learning to put a full stop on it. But many times I think for me, or maybe some of the women who can relate to this, we put a comma and then we continue that criticism and turn that into interpretation. So it's not a criticism, it's an interpretation in our inner mind. So for me, how I unpack that interpretation that was originally a criticism is I actually unpack that with an external friend. Unpacking my inner critics with an external friend. And then while debating on it, a really good friend sometimes can help you hear and see the perspective of it just as a piece of information and nothing more than that. Yeah. What do you think, Jazzy?
I totally do that myself. I find that whenever I have someone who can relate and resonate with, I call it this, a vomit. So my internal critic might be going crazy. And so in order to clean it up, I have a specific person I call. And whenever I do, he's just like, hello. And it's like me going off. And then I realize that I start giving myself the advice. I'm like, oh, I see. Maybe like 5-10 minutes later, I'm like, you know what? Thank you. I got to self-advise. As long as I get to externalize like what the inner critic is saying, because inside it's a dialogue that goes back and forth and it could feel and sound like an argument or just the crux. But as soon as I let it out, it tends to unfold. And it always helps to have that external check, like a friend, just to be able to give that extra perspective or insight. So I find that to be very useful.
Speaking of inner critic, it takes me back to that quote that they sometimes say where we're all our own worst critic. Mm-hmm. I've heard that throughout my entire life and I believe it. I mean, at this point, it's definitely one of those things where we all as humans have to realize that sometimes we beat ourselves up in our minds, like we're not good enough, we're not this enough, like it's just so many we're not, but that's all stuff that we have to stop telling ourselves. I mean, we're all capable of great things, positive, wonderful things. And especially like when it comes to even raising our children, like reminding them that anything is possible and not to let the critics, bring you down and make you think otherwise. That's very important, especially looking generations, forward. What we want for the world and is to have people believe that everything is possible. Good things are possible.
So I have a question. How do we turn critics into songs?
Ooh, I like that.
Critics are kind of like fingers going down a chalkboard. How do we change it from the chalkboard and fingernails to a song?
I think maybe if we see the intention behind the critic, if it's meant to elevate us, meant to encourage us and help us to grow, rather than feeding their egos, or rather than it really about them. So I think coming back to the first few points that we talk about, which is asking for clarification, because a lot of times I think when people give us critics, they know how to give us criticisms, but they don't know how to give us suggestions. So perhaps we can influence the direction of the criticism and ask them, what are your suggestions? Mm-hmm. And then turn that into music and songs for our ears.
I want to share a personal story about a critic. I had someone that I valued and cared for very much in my life, but that person had a lot of inner turmoil and had grown up very, very angry and utilized that criticism to feel better about themselves. I'm sure it didn't, but that was And it was so hurtful to me that I became like a puddle. I just was like, I call it a puddle where you don't know what to do and you just kind of stop and you're paralyzed and you don't know what to say. And you feel like I felt like I was about 2 years old. There was nothing I could say to make it better. And it just hurt. And I left. And I wish that I had done things differently, but that's when my inner work started, to love myself, to be able to fill that void myself, instead of looking for somebody else to give me the validation. So it set me on a journey to help me love me. And people are going to say things, they may have different perspectives, they may view the world differently. We all know couples that fight differently. One will be the screamer and one will be the quiet person. But in the criticism, I think it's important for us to, what can I learn from this? And now, as I look back on that, I can really be grateful, because what it did was it gave me the opportunity to say, this isn't working in my life. I don't want to be like this. I don't want to be a puddle of emotion. What do I have to do to make changes in me so that I get validation from me and I can validate others? And I think sometimes the hardest things in our life like that, the criticisms, the hurt, and I think of kids who are bullied, it's never fun, but if you can turn it around and say, how can I make this work for me? How can it be a beautiful point in my life where I change rather than this is the worst thing that ever happened to me? I think that's when it turns into a song.
Hello, baby girl. Welcome to Lotus Chat.
Welcome to Lotus Chat.
Yeah, she's been talking outside my door this whole time. So I just wanted to listen in. Okay, where were we?
We were talking about how do we turn critics into songs.
Yeah.
That's a good one. Well, when I turn critics into songs, it's when I am listening to, when I hear the story. So for instance, if a critic sounds like a metal garage band song, how do I transition it into finding the light and the harmony? Because I know that when I encounter someone who has negativity going on, that is the dialogue that they're creating in the reality. Mm-hmm. And I know that I align with people to be able to shine some sort of insight. And so by doing so, by finding a place that at least can bring them to a neutral state, and then to start evoking questions that can create a more desired dialogue. I feel like that is when I turn the critic into a song that is more pleasant to hear, or at least to feel. What about you?
Well, Jazzy and Laura, hello, little one. I thank you for sharing all of that. And Laura, the story that you just shared really did hit home for me personally, because of it definitely brought back some memories of where I've been. And as much as I can say that that one does learn from their relationships in the past. And if it wasn't for those relationships going the way they did, we wouldn't be here today doing this wonderful thing.
Yes.
I mean, I'm grateful that there's a country song, like all the winding roads that lead me back to you. I mean, this is what it's done. Like everything that's happened in the past, as much as it was difficult, has given us such positive results now, because we recognize ourselves as powerful women. We recognize ourselves as wonderful human beings. And yes, we also, and I encourage everybody to also dig deep and accept that, yes, there are things that have hurt. There are things that have been hard. But when you're able to really look at yourself in a positive way and see the world differently as not out to get you, then that's when everything changes. And that's the biggest lesson I think I've learned throughout this process and this journey with all these lovely ladies here today. And as Laura mentioned, when you have that coach who's there to help you along the process, it's very helpful. And I highly encourage everybody to have a really great support system behind you when you're going through this journey of self-discovery and acceptance of the shadow, the light and the dark within each of us. And whether it's just a singular friend that you go to when you're having a problem, like call them up, even if it's just something small, a family member, somebody, a counselor, anyone like that. Like, I encourage everybody to just talk it out. And that really is helpful. And that's helped me. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Another way that I also was inspired by what you said just now, Jen, is that how we turn critics into songs is that we see it from a gratitude perspective. And when we are grateful and in the mindset of grateful, we can't be emotional or we can't be negative. So bear in mind that when somebody gives us critics, it actually requires time, emotion, and they actually really care about you. So if we can turn that, and I think one of the trainings that we went through together, there was this line that we say, which is, thank you for caring enough about me to give me that feedback. And I think by saying that, it turns that critics into songs, because you then flip the script into a perspective of gratitude. And that is both for our internal self and the external self, because sometimes we are trapped in the emotions. So when we actually say that line, thank you for caring enough about me to give me that feedback, I think we are able to switch that into a song mode.
I also really love when you brought up the shadow, Miss Jen. I think it's important when our inner critic does come up, because it is the form of a shadow at times. And it is about embracing, not necessarily ignoring the naysaying that's happening, but acknowledging that, okay, this is a part of me that gets to be felt, and to feel that emotion fully and to allow it to pass, because we get to choose differently. And like Zian said, to choose to be grateful for what it is about us. And even the external critics, to be grateful that they're the contrast in our experience. So that way, now we know what we don't like, and now we know what we do, so we can choose differently, and also thank them for showing up the way that they did, because it's more about them than it is about us most of the time when the external critics are saying what they say. And I think that allows for us to personally develop and just choose differently in each moment.
Anything else that we haven't covered that you would like to share with our audience?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank all these ladies here. It's such a privilege to just chat with you each week. Our goal in Lotus Chat is to empower women collectively and to talk about areas and subjects that matter to you, that will help you in your daily life. Things that you may not talk about with others, we hope that you'll talk about with us. One thing I really want to ask you is, we value your feedback. So if you're watching us on YouTube or on Spotify, please leave a message for us. We value it. Vanessa gave us great feedback, wanted us to talk about this. And this has been an awesome topic tonight. So thank you, Vanessa. So if you want to be our special person that we dedicate the show to, please put in the chat what it is that you'd like for us to talk about and things on your mind, and we would really value that. Please look forward this week. We are going to be posting videos of each of us singly, so you can get to know us individually, who we are and what we do. So it would be a great opportunity for you to get to know each of us. And please, I'm going to be the broken record because Jazzy told me to. Please look at YouTube and subscribe. If you are on Spotify, like my son Logan, please do what you need to do on Spotify to favorite us, whatever that is, and make sure that you share with your friends and share with others about this, because we really want to reach and affect as many people as we can and talk about collective things that matter to you, because if they matter to you, they also matter to us. So with that, I'm going to say goodnight and thank the ladies here. And next week, one more thing. Next week, we're going to talk about the 5 love languages. If you've never heard about it, go get the book either on Audible or my favorite, Amazon.com, but there might be other ways that you buy books. So the 5 love languages, it's a very valuable book. So if you'd like to read that this week, we'll be talking about it next Wednesday evening. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. Thank you to the ladies, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.